Hello and welcome to the Midnight Bible Study. Today's topic is Darwinism and why it's a complete failure. Why the theory is a failure. And I'm gonna basically take it apart in a few minutes here, and we're gonna look at the actual evidence. And it's going to become, to anyone with an open mind, it'll become clear that the theory of Darwinism is weak. And this is not going to persuade any true believers. I understand that. Typically, you show a true believer a body and he's going to tell you there's no victim. So I understand that, and the reasons for that we'll talk about in tomorrow's video, which are actually shocking. But today we're just going to look at the evidence. We're going to look at why Darwinism fails, and we'll get right into it. Fail number one. Let's look at the Piltdown man. The Piltdown man. Now, by the way, let me ask you guys a question. Have you ever dug a hole, dug a foundation in your backyard, anything like that, or dug anywhere for that matter? And when you were digging, did you find the missing link? Did you find any evidence of the missing link? I'm talking about the famous skeleton of the half man, half ape, which was a big deal in the 18th century, early 20th century. Sorry about that. And because if you could find the missing link, you'd essentially prove that Darwin was right. There is, man was an ape, and he, degree by degree, he transformed into none other than your next door neighbor. In fact, if that's true, if it's man's nature to just transform from man into ape, well, what's going to stop him from continuing to transform into something else? I mean, why aren't we seeing people transforming into something else, like maybe a giraffe or something like that? So we'd see people walking around half man, half giraffe, or whatever they're turning into. Or, why aren't we finding these skeletons in our backyards, these half man, half apes, or anywhere in the world? Anybody digging anywhere? These things would be turning up everywhere if that's where, how evolution had come about. But they aren't found ever. Well, with one exception. They did find one, actually. They call it the Piltdown man. And the Piltdown man, now, here's a description of it by Michael Price in his article. I'll tell you the article name in just a moment. But the big-brained, ape-jawed Piltdown man was hailed as a major missing link in human evolution when he was discovered in a gravel pit outside a small UK village in 1912. The find set the pace for evolutionary research for decades and established the United Kingdom as an important site in human evolution. Well, there you go. I mean, that would seem to solve it, and that would seem to prove evolution right there. But let's look at the title of Michael Price's article. Study reveals culprit behind Piltdown man, one of the science's most famous hoaxes. So the only problem with the Piltdown man is that he turned out to be one of the most famous frauds in scientific history. We don't hear much about it today. I don't believe they cover this in our school textbooks when they teach us about evolution, and that evolution is fact. Now, what was this Piltdown hoax? It was a human cranium paired with an orangutan's jaw and teeth. An orangutan's jaw and teeth. So you take the cranium and you pair it up with a orangutan's jaw and teeth and say, well, these go together, and they were found right together, and so this is proof of half man, half ape. So, but who would do something like that? I mean, to literally fool everybody and essentially make a fool out of everybody who believes you. Well, who would do that? According to Michael Price in his article, I'm sorry, this is actually from science.org website. According to them, the likeliest hand belongs to Charles Dawson, not Charles Darwin, but Charles Dawson. who died almost 100 years ago, de Groot says, an amateur geologist, archaeologist, and historian. He regularly attended meetings of geologists and anthropologists. He was an inveterate fossil hunter and with access to collections and the knowledge of what prehistoric finds should look like. He also had a habit of small-time forgery, with several other of his less celebrated findings later being shown to be fakes. More than anything, he was desperate for acceptance and recognition within the UK scientific community. That's an interesting motive. He was desperate for acceptance and recognition within the UK scientific community. Very enlightening. De Groot says, letters reveal his persistent but ultimately fruitless attempts to join the Royal Society. So here we have this Charles Dawson, desperate for acceptance and to be, accepted by the scientific community and part of this exclusive club. And he was willing to pull off a fraud in order to make it happen. Shocking. Now, the Piltdown Man. According to Britannica.com, that's the encyclopedia, Britannica.com, in a series of discoveries, 1910 to 12, Charles Dawson, an English lawyer and amateur geologist, found what appeared to be the fossilized fragments of a cranium, jawbone, and other specimens in a gravel formation at Bockham Manor in Piltdown Commons near Lewes, Sussex. Dawson took the specimens to Arthur Smith Woodward, keeper of the British Museum's Pantheology Department, who announced the findings at a meeting of the Geological Society of London on December 18th, 1912. By the way, we're going to get to the real evidence in just a moment here. Woodward claims that fossils represented a previously unknown species of extinct hominin. This is who made this announcement? Woodward, keeper of the British Museum's Pantheology Department. He was taken in by this fraud, apparently, or whatever. He made the announcement. Woodward claimed that the fossils represented a previously unknown species of human hominin that could be the missing evolutionary link between apes and early humans. So there you go. Dawson got the recognition he was seeking. However, the fraud was exposed. The day of reckoning finally arrived on November 21st, 1953, when the London newspaper, The Times, echoed a study published that same day in the Bulletin of the Museum of Natural History, in which scientists Kenneth Oakley, Wilfred Legras Clark, and Joseph Wiener applied new techniques to prove definitively that the Piltdown Man was carefully crafted fraud that fully matched what Weidenreich had suggested 3 decades earlier. So that's it's disappointing that Dawson was such a, that he would do something like that just to be accepted by these scientists. So, Dr. Michael Denton, let's move to the present tense. Dr. Michael Denton holds a PhD degree in biochemistry. Denton wrote a book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, and it may be in crisis. We've just seen from the Piltground, if the Piltdown Man is a symbol of the entire evolutionary movement, then the whole thing is a moving crisis. But let's see what Dr. Michael Denton said, who holds a PhD in biochemistry, and he wrote the book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. Here's a quote. If anyone was chasing a phantom or retreating from empiricism, it was surely Darwin, not Dawson, but Darwin, the one and only. If anyone was chasing a phantom or retreating from empiricism, that's empiricism, essentially, experimentation, evidence, the scientific method. If anyone was retreating from the scientific method and actual evidence, it was surely Darwin, who himself freely admitted that he had absolutely no hard empirical evidence that any of the major evolutionary transformations proposed had ever actually occurred. Okay, that was Charles Darwin himself admitting that his theory is a failure. It has no scientific basis. It doesn't cut at all. So you might be wondering, well, wait a minute, but this is taught as fact in every school. and with no alternative theories allowed. That's what Darwin said. He said right here. He himself freely admitted that he had absolutely no hard empirical evidence that any of the major evolutionary transformations proposed had ever actually occurred. Okay, so I'll talk in my video tomorrow. I'm going to cover why our schools and scientists continue to perpetuate this theory, and it's frankly shocking. It was Darwin, the evolutionist, who admitted in his letter to Asa Gray that one's, quote, imagination must fill up very wide blanks. Okay, so essentially what Darwin is admitting is that he's a science fiction writer. With a lot of, I'm all right. I write fiction myself. I've written 20 novels, and I can assure you a lot of research goes into those novels. You don't just come up with this stuff because it doesn't come off as realistic. In order to write a good novel, tremendous amounts of research sometimes occurs. And that's what Darwin was doing. He was doing a lot of research, which he maybe hoped would turn out to be science, but as it turned out, as he says himself, imagination must fill up very wide blanks, Denton. So we have to look at this stuff. More from Michael Denton. Here's a quote from his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. While Darwin was attempting to convince the world of the validity of evolution by natural selection, he was admitting privately to friends to moments of doubt over its capacity to generate very complicated adaptations. You have to just consider what he's saying. In fact, Darwin had no idea how right he was. He had no idea. He was barely scratching the surface of a massive problem in his theory, which was, as he said, my little theory about this little cell, and it's just going to and it's going to adapt and turn into a human being. Do you have any idea how complicated a human being is, and the systems that have to be created? It's extremely complicated. It's extremely complicated. You look at a book like Anatomica here. It's about almost 900 pages of systems. 900 pages of systems, and all the mechanics of the body. You've got the eyes, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the heart, thousands of feet of blood vessels that may run into miles, actually, of blood vessels throughout our body. And system after system after system after system after system, all of them are worked to perfection. Your heart beats day in and day out, 24/7 when you're awake or asleep, to perfection, day in, day out, for 80 years in many cases, sometimes cases over 100 years. And all of this just happens, totally randomly from some random cell in a pool in a swamp. Okay? So Darwin knew he had an extremely big problem. This is science fiction, and he knew his problem. His theory was on thin ice, to say the least. Darwin admits that, quote, the eye to this day gives me a cold shudder. In other words, Darwin knew that the eye was extremely complicated, and it's not just going to happen because there was a cell in a swamp. So, all right, clearly Darwin knew his theory failed to answer the most basic questions. So there you go. Now let's take a look at Darwin's correspondence. In an 1863 letter, Darwin amplified by pointing out, this comes from Piercy, a book by Piercy. Okay, here it is. Darwin's letter. Darwin amplified by pointing out that evolution by natural selection was, quote, grounded entirely on general considerations. This is Charles Darwin saying his whole theory is based on general considerations. That's not very scientific, folks. General ideas that we throw out there and hope they're true, and we try to find evidence for them, but then we go, wait a minute, where could the eye come from? That's way, 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 way beyond this simplistic theory I've come up with. Okay, so anyway, so Darwin was worried that his natural selection was grounded entirely, not partially, entirely on general considerations, such as the difference between contemporary organisms and fossil organisms. Quote, "When we descend to the details," he wrote, "we can prove that no one species has changed." That's not me. That's Darwin who's saying this. Darwin says, when we get into the details, we can prove, this is apparently the only thing he can prove, is that no species has changed. That's tough. That's a tough one to say when you're promoting evolution. He adds to that, he says that cannot prove a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial. If they would have happened, we don't know that they would be good. I mean, why would we turn into a perfect human? Why wouldn't we turn into a messed up animal in this messed up world we live in, maybe a half beast, half man? Nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. So in other words, that is the theory, that they would be beneficial, not provable. Nor can we explain why some of the species have changed and others have not. Yeah, that would be important. If this theory was legitimate, you'd be able to prove that. But Darwin admits point after point nothing. Darwin is simply admitting his theory proves absolutely nothing. The only people who can prove this is true are the science teachers in our schools, who absolutely swear over their graves that this is true in many cases. And if you confront them on that, it'll hurt your grade, and it'll provoke a reaction. I've seen science teachers react over Darwinism, and it can descend into profanity very quickly. So there's an emotional attachment to this theory, which it goes beyond today's talk, but it's interesting that that profanity never gets into the evidence, as we're discussing why. Okay, Hook. Oh, I want you to think about this, folks. I want you to imagine a dark night in a remote swamp. The only light is from the moon. A dark figure with a hunchback is limping through the swamp with a gunny sack slung over his back. He stops and shines his flashlight on the gunny sack. He puts down the gunny sack in the muddy bank, and he shines his flashlight on it and reveals that the gunny sack is soaked through with blood. He opens it up and begins removing body parts that he's dug up in graveyards. He throws the arms, the legs into the swamp. He throws a bag of guts and entrails into the swamp. He lifts up a head by the hair and he tosses that into the water. Then he fires up a generator, which he had brought on his previous trip there. So that's motoring along, a gas-powered generator. And that generator produces electricity, and he has wires hooked up to it. And he takes those electric wires and he puts them in the water, just like zaps the water. Everything within 10 or 20 feet gets a big electric shock from these electric wires, almost as if lightning flashed down from the sky and electrified the water for a moment, like we might see in Frankenstein, for example. So then he leaves that in there a few seconds, not too long, and then he pulls it out, and he sits down in his fold-out chair and waits. And he's very patient. He waits beyond the witching hour, 3 a.m. Finally, he sees the water stir. A large, ugly man rises from the water. The gravedigger has just proved evolution. This is the swamp theory, where life is formed in the remote swamp when all the proper ingredients are together. Now, of course, that's a ridiculous scenario. Nobody would buy that. That was anything more than, a fiction story. However, that's essentially the evolution. That's essentially the story of evolution. Except this crazy story I just told is far more likely to create a living man than evolution itself. After all of the ingredients for a man were present. You had all the flesh, the guts, everything. It was all there. What if none of that was there and he just shocked the water? Would we expect to see a man rise up? Well, there's just mud there. What's going to cause a man to rise out of that? There's been swamps around for forever, and we never see men rising out of swamps. It never happens. If Darwinism was through, every once in a while, men would be rising out of swamps. I mean, either the theory continues or it doesn't, or it never was. Now, if a swamp can't create life when all the parts are present, then of course if nothing is there, then it's not going to do it. Darwinism is a failed theory. It's perpetuated on the public by the science community. And I'm going to show that Darwin has no credible basis in science. Tomorrow's video, I'm going to show why a failed theory has survived the test of time. And that's really the shocking part in my opinion. Okay, first let's look at why Darwinism fails. Chemist James Tour is not only one of the most respected scientists in the world, he also works in the origin of life field. There's probably no one alive who knows more about this than he does. I mean, there's lots of scientists. They don't know anything about Darwinism. They're doing other things. They have all kinds of different specialties. James Tour specializes in origin of life. Here's a quote from James Tour talking about evolution. He says, many biologists suggest that random mutation and natural selection have long been recognized by many evolutionists themselves to be insufficient to account for the complexity of life. There you go. Many biologists suggest that random mutation and natural selection have long been recognized by many evolutionists themselves to be insufficient for the complexity of life. So, of those people who are in the industry, there are many who privately admit the obvious. Okay, I believe there are true believers, and I don't say that every one of them, I don't know, to be honest. It could be that they all know it's a fraud and they have other reasons for keeping it alive, but I can't say for sure. In the book Darwin's Black Box, Michael Behe reports the following on Darwin. He's speaking about Darwin. He realized that if in one generation an organ as complex as the eye suddenly appeared, it would be tantamount to a miracle. That's not really scientific, at least that we know of. I mean, it could be that miracles occur through some scientific laws, but that's not the scientific theory. So Darwin realized that if one generation of an organ as complex as the eye suddenly appeared, it would be tantamount to a miracle. Unfortunately, gradual development of the human eye appeared to be impossible since its many sophisticated features seem to be interdependent. So there you go. That's a tough one to overcome. That's the one that made Darwin go cold. It made his blood go cold. Behe writes, Darwin dismissed the question of the eye's ultimate organ. So how did Darwin ran into this problem with a complex, very complex system that his theory couldn't account for? What was his scientific approach? He dismissed the question. That was how he dealt with that. His theory failed. He dismissed the question and proceeded as if that question never came up. As Behe says, he had an excellent reason for declining the question. It was completely beyond the 19th century science. As a matter of fact, no question about the underlying mechanisms of life could be answered. He didn't know. He didn't have any clue about biology. All right, fail number 3. In 1940s, geneticist Richard Goldschmidt became so disenchanted. This is a geneticist, and he's studying Darwinism. And he's becoming very upset with the theory. He realized this is nonsense. This theory makes no sense whatsoever. And this is a geneticist. He's a very highly educated person. He became so disenchanted with Darwin's explanation for origins of new structures that he was driven to propose the hopeful monster theory. Goldschmidt thought that perhaps a reptile had laid an egg once and from it had hatched a bird. So in other words, this Goldschmidt comes up with this whole hopeful monster theory, which is, okay, a lizard a lizard lays all these eggs, and of course lizards are born because they're lizard eggs. But then one day an egg is hatched and it's a bird from a lizard. That's how he solved the problem, just like that. I mean, when you're faced with a theory like this, you have to go crazy in order to try to make sense of it. In order to Jerry Coyone of the Department of Ecology and Evolution at University of Chicago, Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago, quote, "There's little evidence for neo-Darwinism view. Its theoretical foundations and the experimental evidence supporting it are weak." Congratulations to Jerry Coyne. He must have read the Introduction to Origin of Species, where Darwin says essentially the same thing. He says, there's no evidence for my theory, it's weak. There's nothing here. I don't know if our science teachers have read the Introduction to Origin of Species, but that's where I suspect, I don't know if that's, I mean, maybe Coyne came up with this on his own, but he could have just read Darwin's own book right in the introduction. Fail number 4. Imagine I show up at the swamp and I have the ingredients for some cookies, flour, chocolate chips, salt, a couple of eggs, butter. I throw all the ingredients into the swamp. Are cookies going to emerge? No. We know that there's not going to be any cookies. The ingredients aren't going to come together as a beautiful batch of cookies. Why not? Because swamps don't assemble and create things. What they do is things rot in swamps. They just rot. Or they spread apart. But they don't come together in complicated and intelligent ways. According to National Geographic website, in the article, "All Species Evolved from a Single Cell Study Finds." That's the name of the article. So they're obviously promoting this idea of Darwinism. According to National Geographic, in the article, "All Species Evolved from a Single Cell Study Finds." Here's what they say. All life on Earth evolved from a single-celled organism that lived roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Roughly 3.5 billion years ago. A new study seems to confirm. That's pretty Weasley language. Roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Does it matter if we're off by 50 billion years or 50 million years? I don't know. But a new study seems to confirm. So they've given themselves a weasel clause there. They don't say a new study verifies and proves. No. A new study seems to confirm. I mean, okay. The study supports, really, now it supports. A minute ago it seems to confirm, now it actually supports. I guess it could support just seeming to confirm. The new study supports the widely held, quote, universal common ancestor theory, first proposed by Charles Darwin more than 150 years ago. And there may be some pattern recognition properties going on here where it looks like, okay, yeah, I mean, most of the biological system of an ape may be largely similar to that of a human being. I mean, we all have essentially the same systems. But if you really think about it, that doesn't really make any sense. Why would an ape have a similar biology, or a giraffe? Why would a giraffe have a similar biology to a man? That makes no sense. It would have, if they formed separately in a swamp, they would be totally random. It would be totally different. But no, they have almost 80 or 98.5% similarity. How did that happen? That's awfully coincidental. Really, it almost sounds like there was a designer involved who was doing that, not just some random things happening in a swamp. But anyway, the study supports the widely held so there is something there. It supports the widely held universal common ancestor history theory. So there is a pattern. Darwin did seem to have the ability to recognize the obvious, which is that there are similarities in terms of living creatures. All right, fail number 5. Back to the National Geographic article, quote, all species evolved from a single cell. All right, all of life on Earth evolved from a single organism that lived. Okay, the study supports. All right, hold on a second here. All right, here's about that. Here's my response to this study. Chemist James Tour is not. I talked about James Tour. He's one of the most He's one of the top 50 scientists in the world. He's highly respected. And here's a quote from James Tour. Human alone have the capacity for art, music, advanced communication, advanced mathematics, and religious practice, which constitute the broader organization of symbolism. Okay, we don't see this in any other animal. So this argues against the common descent argument that we're just all argument, because even if our biologies are largely similar, this is a huge difference. This is huge. I mean, we send people to the moon. We create nuclear bombs. We do things that animals don't do. There's a huge gaping gap between a man and an ape or a man and a giraffe. Which argues against the common descent model, even if we do happen to have the same biology in many cases, in many ways. And Tour writes, and the chemical basis of evolutionary mechanisms for such changes is both the mechanism, this is a key point, the mechanism for changes, how do we get from here to there? Totally unknown. The mechanism for such changes is unknown and unmeasurable presently. So there you go. This is all based on wishful thinking. There's no mechanism for the changes that Darwinism would be suggesting. According to Tour, evolution is about the mechanism of change and universal common descent. There is no mechanism of change. This is a quote from Dr. Tour. He says, none. He emphasizes it more than I do, but that's what he says. All right, fail number 6. Dr. David Berlinski. Now, after Berlinski got his PhD, he was a research assistant in the Department of Biology at Columbia University. He went on to teach at Stanford University, Rutgers, and the University of Paris. Dr. Berlinski points out that the fossil record does not support Darwinism. I mentioned before, like it should. Like we should be finding missing links in our backyard, or at least in the local woods, if that were the case. I mean, up in Alaska, they find dinosaur bones. In certain area of Alaska, they find dinosaur bones sticking out of the earth, literally. They don't find missing links, half man, half apes. They don't find those. They do find dinosaur bones. But if Darwinism was a fact, we'd be finding those missing links. Anyway, but he's talking about the fossil record here. Does not support Darwinism. Dr. Berlinski compares Darwinism with the scientific method demonstrated by Newton and shows there is no similar use of the scientific method in Darwinism. Catch that one? Our science teachers in our schools are teaching us Darwinism as a fact. Berlinski is saying there is no scientific method in Darwinism, such as you would find with the way Newton worked. Not the same thing at all. Berlinski shows that, quote, there is no demonstration in Darwinism that this mechanism, random variation, natural selection, is adequate to the generation of this level of complexity. From the point of view of the serious sciences, without which that kind of demonstration, one is completely adrift. In fact, this comes from Berlinski's book, The Devil's Delusion, where he goes into much more explanation on why Darwin fails. You have no idea on whether the mechanism is adequate for its intended person. You're totally adrift. It's just random. So it doesn't work. So there you go. There's just a brief overview on why Darwinism fails. It's it doesn't have any. There's nothing solid in Darwinism whatsoever. It's a clever theory. I have to admit that Darwin, he came up with a clever theory. That in itself, he would have made a good science fiction writer. In fact, maybe he was a science fiction writer. But in terms of an actual theory of the history of mankind, that's a complete failure. It doesn't work, and it's a shame to think that this is what they're teaching in our schools. But we'll talk more about that in tomorrow's video about why that would be going on. Thanks for listening. God bless you, and good night from the Midnight Bible Study.